In my series on Edward Said's Orientalism, today I'll be reading and discussing from page 48 to 49. So let's begin. So please keep in mind that this is chapter 1 of the book, which is entitled Scope of Orientalism. And we are going to finish the first section of chapter 1, which is also specifically entitled Knowing the Orientals. Before we get to today's reading, what we have read and discussed is Said expressing and articulating how, discursively speaking, a certain view of the Orient is developed through institutions, through journals, through poetry, even fictionalized works, and it naturally creates in the minds of the Western reader or writer this East-West binary structure. He gives some examples from earlier times, but then he goes on to say, let me give you two contemporary examples. So in the previous conversation before this, I discussed his reading of an essay by Henry Kissinger. And today, in the culminating part of this section of the chapter, he discusses yet another contemporary essay which was published during the time when he was obviously writing the book. And what it highlights is this naturalized view, unchallenged view, generalized view of the Orient, the Orientals, the Muslims, and the Arabs that can be very easily spewed by these so-called scholars and diplomats without any kind of challenge. And so he's illustrating it by discussing another essay by another author in this section. So, as always, I'll read and then come back and briefly talk about it. Another illustration dovetails neatly, perhaps too neatly, with Kissinger's analysis. In its February 1972 issue, the American Journal of Psychiatry printed an essay by Harold W. Giddens, who is identified as a retired member of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, United States Department of State. The essay's title, The Arab World, its tone and its content argue a highly characteristic Orientalist bent of mind. Thus, for his 4-page double-columned psychological portrait of over 100 million people considered for a period of 1,300 years, Giddens cites exactly 4 sources for his views. A recent book on Tripoli, one issue of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahram, the periodical Oriental Moderno, and a book by Majid Khadouri, a well-known Orientalist. The article itself purports to uncover the inner workings of Arab behavior, which from our point of view is aberrant, but for Arabs is normal. After this auspicious start, we are told that Arabs stress conformity, that Arabs inhabit a shame culture whose prestige system involves the ability to attract followers and clients. As an aside, we are told that Arab society is and always has been based on a system of client-patron relationships, that Arabs can function only in conflict situations, that prestige is based solely on the ability to dominate others, that a shame culture and therefore Islam itself makes a virtue of revenge. Here, Giddens triumphantly cites the June 29, 1970 Ihram to show that in 1969 in Egypt, in 1070 cases of murder where the perpetrators were apprehended, it was found that 20% of the murders were based on a desire to wipe out shame, 30% on a desire to satisfy real or imaginary wrongs, and 31% on a desire for blood revenge. That if, for a Western point of view, the only rational thing for the Arabs to do is to make peace, For the Arabs, the situation is not governed by this kind of logic, for objectivity is not a value in the Arab system. Giddon continues now more enthusiastically, quote, "It is a notable fact that while the Arab value system demands absolute solidarity within the group, it at the same time encourages among its members a kind of rivalry that is destructive of that very solidarity. In Arab society, only success counts and the end justifies the means. Arabs live naturally in a world characterized by anxiety, expressed in generalized suspicion and distrust, which has been labeled free-floating hostility. The art of subterfuge is highly developed in Arab life, as well as in Islam itself. The Arab need for vengeance overrides everything, otherwise the Arab would feel ego-destroying shame. Therefore, if Westerners consider peace to be high on the scale of values, and if we have a highly developed consciousness of the value of time, this is not true of Arabs. In fact, we are told in Arab tribal society, where Arab values originated, strife, not peace, was the normal state of affairs because raiding was one of the two main supports of the economy. The purpose of this learned disquisition is merely to show how on the Western and Oriental scale of values the relative position of the elements is quite different. This is the apogee of Orientalist confidence. No merely asserted generality is denied the dignity of truth. No theoretical list of Oriental attributes is without application to the behavior of Orientals in the real world. On the one hand, there are Westerners, and on the other, there are Arab Orientals. The former are, in no particular order, rational, peaceful, liberal, logical, capable of holding real values without natural suspicion. The latter are none of these things. Out of what collective and yet particularized view of the Orient do these statements emerge? What specialized skills, what imaginative pressures, what institutions and traditions, what cultural forces produce such similarity in the descriptions of the Orient to be found in Cromer, Balfour, and our contemporary statesmen? So what we gather from these two accounts of what Said calls the contemporary works of writing and publication about the Arab world is what he has been trying to convince us all along, is about this discursive framework in which views of the other, in this case the Orient, are so deeply disseminated, accepted, articulated, that authors and critics and writers do not even feel the need to particularize or justify their views. They can throw out these generalizations as accepted truths. And what I just read to you, there is obviously a dichotomy that the author has internalized. There is the liberal humanist West, which believes in democracy, which is mutable, which grows. And then there is this immutable Arab world with Arabs in it who are perpetually caught in the so-called shame culture, who are naturally warlike, right, and who thrive in those kind of atavistic pursuits. And this binary structure existed 200 years before this essay was published, existed when that essay was published about which Said is talking about, and exists even now today. If you just read New York Times or whatever about the contemporary conflict and destruction of Gaza, the Palestinians by and large are represented as these ossified people with natural violent tendencies. And against them, the state of Israel is offered as this democracy under siege, whose army is the so-called most moral army in the world, right? These tropes and this internalized view of the Muslim world and the Arabs still functions, still underwrites politics and policy and people's opinions even today. Now, if you carefully reread these passages, he ends this section with certain questions, right? What prompts such a way of looking at the Arab world? What underwrites it, right? Because all along what he's trying to teach us is that there is a discourse perpetuated by institutions, by journals, by conferences, by individual authors even, which the Orient is represented a certain way. Jumbled up, millions upon millions of people can be issued and assigned fixed attributes. And that is no accident, that it is an outcome. This view of the Arab world or the Orient or Islam or the Muslims is an outcome of a larger discourse which is historical and which is still persistent. And that is what he calls Orientalism. And here he ends the first section of chapter 1, in which basically what he discussed was, how do the Europeans know the Oriental? What way do they define the so-called Oriental? The chapter is entitled Scope of Orientalism. So obviously, after the introduction, which we have thoroughly discussed, we are now moving into how expansive is it as a discourse? What does it underwrite? And in this section of the chapter, he starts with Balfour and the British diplomats, their view of Egypt and how they viewed Egypt and the Middle East in their own times. And then he brings us to the contemporary view of the Arab world, and what we realize to our horror that not much has changed. And you, me, and everyone else who's living in today's world in the 21st century, we can attest to that these tropes and these ways of looking at the Arab world or the Muslim world are still perpetuated, still generalized, and still assigned to millions upon millions of people. So that's where I end this section of chapter 1. I'll be back with more. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. I'm pretty sure I have missed some really important things in this section. I'll be back with the next section of chapter 1. Until then, stay safe, take care, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you, and peace and love.